Mary had a little man.
We believe that all men are created equal.
To the magnificent mosaic that is America.
From radio beacon to radio beacon. I have a dream today. Change has come to America.
Believe me.
Help is on the way.
Knock, knock. Who's there?
It's a figment of your imagination.
Randi Rhodes Show.
Turn up your mind.
Oh, it's Friday, you bastards. Friday is what it is. And right now we have the Hennepin County Medical Examiner, Dr. Andrew Baker, on the stand testifying about the cause of death, the result of the autopsy that he personally performed prior to... He's very cute, I must say. He reminds me of my friend Glenn. Glenn Abbott. Yeah, he looks just like Glenn Abbott is what it is. But anyway, that said, before he was on the stand, Andrew Baker, that is, who looks like a 1980s fashion model, is, you know, that's why he reminds me of Glenn. Anyway, before that, we had Dr. Lindsay Thomas. She is a forensic pathologist, and she actually looked at all the evidence that was developed during the autopsy and made some conclusions about the cause of death herself. Now, the cause of death, according to her, the cause of death, according to the Sergeant Steiger, who testified a couple days ago, the cause of death, according to Dr. Martin Tobin, who testified yesterday, the cause of death, according to Dr. Smock, who also testified yesterday, positional asphyxiation, meaning the cop, Chauvin, stood on top of George Floyd for so long with so much weight on top of his neck, back, and chest area, face down on the ground with his hands behind his back, and caused him to die. Okay, so let us listen to Dr. Andrew Baker, who looks just like Glenn Abbott, talking about George Floyd's lungs.
Panels or screens too from the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's office?
Yes, all of our postmortem toxicology is done by NMS.
Are you familiar with a toxicologist named Dr. Eisenschmidt?
Yes, I know Dan.
Brett's leaning towards Dudley Do right at this point.
Dr. Eisenschmidt testified here just time flies. I don't know if it was yesterday or 2 days ago.
Little Dr. Ronnie Jackson in there
testified
too.
Here. Do you have a good opinion of him as a toxicologist?
He has been great to work with so far. We
Objection is sustained.
Irrelevant.
Well, you know Dr. Eisenschmidt.
I do.
Did you examine the contents of Mr. Floyd's stomach as part of your autopsy?
I did.
What did you note regarding the contents?
Counselor, can I refer to my report so that I don't...
Yes, if it helps refresh your recollection.
I'm simply going to quote what I dictated as part of the postmortem exam. The stomach contains approximately 450 milliliters of dark brown fluid with innumerable soft fragments of gray-white food particulate matter resembling bread.
Did you note anything resembling either a pill or pill fragments in the stomach contents?
I did not.
Oh, wow. Wow, no
Did you
pills.
do any testing of the contents of Mr. Floyd's stomach as a part of the toxicology assessment for Mr. Floyd?
So I wouldn't do any testing of that. It is possible that we could send it to a lab like NMS for testing, but I did not request that.
So were you aware of whether or not Mr. Floyd had tested positive for COVID?
Yes, I was aware of that. Not at the time I did the autopsy, but I became aware of that later.
Was that significant to you in any way?
That he had tested positive for COVID?
Yes, sir.
I guess it kind of depends on what you mean by significant. This was very early in the pandemic, and we were still scrambling to figure out things like autopsy safety protocols and what we should be wearing. So in that sense, it was significant. In Mr. Floyd's specific case, the fact that he had been COVID positive 7 or 8 weeks before he passed away did not factor into my cause of death determination because I didn't see any signs of COVID at his autopsy, and his lungs did not have any of the stigmata of COVID that I would expect to see under the microscope.
So was he clinically symptomatic from your point of view?
I can't assess that because I didn't know Mr. Floyd when he was alive. To the best of my knowledge, he was generally healthy on May 25th before the events of that evening. I'm unaware that he was suffering from any acute COVID symptoms at that time.
You also know that Mr. Floyd had sickle cell trait. What can you tell us about that?
Sickle cell trait is carried by about 8% of Americans of African heritage. What it means is that one of the genes that codes for the beta chain of hemoglobin has an abnormal substitution in it. If you just have sickle cell trait, chances are you will go through life and never have any symptoms from it because you make plenty of normal hemoglobin. That's very different than sickle cell disease, which means that both of the genes have that gene substitution, and then you have sickle cell disease. People with sickle cell disease can get very severe anemia, they can have sickle cell crises, they're subject to a variety of infections and other complications. But Mr. Floyd didn't have that, he just had the one gene for sickle cell trait. I wouldn't even have known that, except that it happens that people who have sickle cell trait, when you take a biopsy of one of their tissues and put it in formaldehyde, which is what pathologists do with all tissue, the formaldehyde can cause cells to sickle as a post-mortem artifact. And so when I saw that on Mr. Floyd's slides, I immediately called the hospital lab and I said, do you have a peripheral blood smear for Mr. Floyd? And it turned out they had made a blood smear during his CPR. And so I had a pathologist who specializes in blood disorders look at the slide and confirm there was no evidence that Mr. Floyd was sickling on his peripheral smear during life. I did also have our lab then run a sickle cell quantitation, which means they actually quantify the abnormal hemoglobin in the blood. And sure enough, that came back with the exact number that would be consistent with Mr. Floyd having sickle cell trait. So it's really just a fluke that it got picked up at autopsy. In my opinion, it doesn't have anything to do with why he died.
All right. What about paraganglioma, a kind of tumor? I'll just ask you about the paraganglioma as to whether you found or concluded that it had anything to do with Mr. Floyd's death.
So the short answer is I don't feel Mr. Floyd's paraganglioma had anything to do with his death. What we're talking about is an incidental tumor that I happened to find in his pelvis during the autopsy. I did look at it under the microscope. The most likely diagnosis is a paraganglioma, but I have no reason to believe that had anything to do with Mr. Floyd's death.
Okay. So Dr. Baker, want to switch and talk about the death certificate.
Okay.
So if we could pull up Exhibit 194. First, I'd like to talk to you about the press release report.
Okay.
And ask you first, Dr. Baker, if you would just identify what this is for the record.
Yes, what you are looking at is the final press release my office put out once I had reached my conclusion as to the cause and manner of Mr. Floyd's death.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what it means to certify a death?
To certify death as a physician means that you fill in the decedent's cause of death and their manner of death. And if their manner of death is other than natural, then you also have to fill in the how injury occurred box on the death certificate. Death certificates are relatively standard in the United States. Most of what's on them is largely dictated by the Centers for Disease Control. They vary a little bit in appearance from state to state, but the core elements are pretty much the same in every jurisdiction. Most of what's on a death certificate is actually filled in by family members and the funeral director. So, what's the decedent's full name? Where were they born? What are the names of their parents? Did they ever serve in the armed forces? There's all kinds of things that are captured. The medical examiner's primary role, again, as I mentioned, is the cause of death, the manner of death, and the how injury occurred. Most death certificates in the United States are actually filled out by clinicians, meaning your primary care doctor that you see.
Okay, so he's explaining the cause and manner of death, which are two different things. We learned that today if you were watching. Dr. Lindsay Thomas taught us that. There's, lots of causes, but only 5 manners. Accidental, homicide, what was the other? George Floyd's is homicide. That's the manner of death. He died from a homicide, not an accidental overdose, which would have been accidental.
Clear. A
things Randi at RandiRhodes.com.
Go for launch.
Speaking truth to power, the Randi Rhodes Show.
All right, so the prosecution, Attorney Blackwell, is questioning the medical examiner, the lead medical examiner from Hennepin County, Andrew Baker, who's very cute. Very, very cute, I have to say. And they're asking him now about his cardiopulmonary condition, meaning, do you believe that he died of a heart attack? Now, of course, the manner of death on the death certificate that was signed by Dr. Andrew Baker, the lead medical examiner in Hennepin County, there's only 5 manners of death, as we were just trying to explain. There is undetermined, can't figure it out. There is suicide. There is homicide, there's accidental, which would be a drug overdose, okay? And natural, which would encompass all diseases that are known in nature. Cancer, heart disease, right? That would say natural. If you ever wondered why it says that on, your parents, God forbid, or, their death certificate, natural causes, even though you know that they died of cancer or whatever, it's because that occurs in nature. So they say natural, cause of death is natural. On George Floyd's death certificate, the manner of death is homicide. It's homicide. So now we're being walked through whether or not George Floyd had hypertensive heart disease, high blood pressure, or any other heart disease that would have caused him to suddenly die under Chauvin's knee.
And in my opinion, the law enforcement subdual restraint and the neck compression was just more than Mr. Floyd could take by virtue of those heart conditions.
So, Dr. Baker, just a point of clarification that frankly occurs to me as you were talking. As a forensic pathologist, it's not part of what you do within the 4 corners of your job to try to calculate what Mr. Floyd's either lung volumes or oxygen reserves or that sort of thing would have been, is it?
I think what you're getting at, Counselor, is the sort of thing that I would defer to a pulmonologist. Those are obviously things we can't measure post-mortem in living people. Clearly, those things are the purview of pulmonologists.
Right. So Dr. Baker, we did find from the toxicology amounts of fentanyl and methamphetamine in the results from the lab.
That is correct.
You didn't mention either fentanyl or meth in Mr. Floyd's system. You mentioned those, but you don't list either of them on the top line as causes of death. Why is that?
Well, the top line of the cause of death is really what you think is the most important thing that precipitated the death. Other things that you think played a role in the death but were not direct causes get relegated to what's known as the other significant conditions part of the death certificate. So the other significant conditions are things that played a role in the death but didn't directly cause the death. So, for example, Mr. Floyd's use of fentanyl did not cause the subdual or neck restraint. His heart disease did not cause the subdual or the neck restraint.
All right. So these are items that may have contributed but weren't the direct cause.
Correct.
No further questions, Dr. Baker.
Sure.
Okay, they're going to head to a sidebar before poor Eric has to question Andrew Baker, the Hennepin County medical examiner. All right, so we're definitely caught up. If you didn't see this morning's session, if you didn't see this morning's court proceedings, let me just tell you that Dr. Lindsay Thomas, she is a forensic pathologist. She testified very plainly that George Floyd died from asphyxiation caused by Derek Chauvin. Yesterday, when we were on the air, you could hear the testimony of Dr. Tobin, who was just amazing, walking the jury through what they should look for on the videotapes, how to count respiratory rates, how to count the number of breaths, how to see whether or not he was hyperventilating, how to see whether or not he was alive, how to see whether or not he was in, something called hysterical delirium, or that, which a toxicologist testified also yesterday, and a Dr. Smock testified yesterday. Dr. Smock is the police surgeon. He is an ER physician and also the Minneapolis Police Department's surgeon. And he testified that there is a condition that he believes is real called, some sort of crazy delirium, but he said that it's not really an accepted thing from the American Medical Association, whatever. But he thinks it's real. He does. He says in his experience as an ER doctor, he does think it's real. But he walked you through like the 6 different bullet points of symptoms that a person would have to present with in order to say that he was suffering from this, crazy delirium thing. And George Floyd met none of those bullet points. That he didn't feel pain. He said George Floyd did feel pain. That he was, not able to talk. That he whatever. He went through like the whole list, and George Floyd did not meet 6 of those things. In fact, he didn't meet any of those things. So Dr. Smock also testified that George Floyd died not from fentanyl. That George Floyd died from Chauvin's knee on his back.
So, Doctor, let's talk about your opinions regarding the cause of Mr. Floyd's death.
Yes, sir.
You formulated opinions.
Yes, sir, I did.
Would you tell us what your opinion or opinions are?
Mr. Floyd died from positional asphyxia, which is a fancy way of saying he died because he had no oxygen left in his body.
So what we've been referring to as low oxygen.
Low oxygen is one way. No oxygen. When the body is deprived of oxygen, and in this case from his chest, pressure on his chest and back, he gradually succumbed to lower and lower levels of oxygen until it was gone and he died.
Okay, so there's Dr. Smock, and Dr. Smock also further testified, no, not fentanyl, no.
When you watch those videos and we go through them, what is his respiration do? He's breathing. He's talking. He's not snoring. He is saying, please, please get off of me. I want to breathe. I can't breathe. That is not a fentanyl overdose. That is somebody begging to breathe.
Oh! I mean, the testimony's been pretty damning and consistent. There's been a little difference between some of the testimonies, just slightly, ever so slightly, but for the most part, the medical testimony has been very, very consistent. Not a drug overdose, not excited delirium. That he was, expressing right there, Dr. Smock was, why it's not excited delirium and why it wasn't fentanyl. But that it was positional asphyxiation, begging for air, and literally subconsciously his body doing everything it needed to do to try to bring air into it.
Call in, connect. To speak to Randi, call 561-270-3844.
561-270-3844.
All right, the lawyers are in a sidebar at the Derek Chauvin trial right now. I'm going to play you a little bit of the morning court proceedings where Dr. Lindsay Thomas, who is a forensic pathologist, testified about the cause of death.
Do you agree with Dr. Baker's determination on the cause of death?
Yes, I do. This is a death where both the heart and lungs stopped working. And the point is that it's due to law enforcement subdual, restraint, and compression. The activities of the law enforcement officers resulted in Mr. Floyd's death, and that specifically those activities were the subdual, the restraint, and the neck compression.
Oh. Restraint and neck compression. Subdual just means, subduing. That the action of subduing George Floyd was a subdual restraint. Okay, just so you're not confused. Everybody agrees. I mean, it's pretty consistent across all medical specialties. And remember, we have heard from every single medical specialty that, listen, I wish, I got this kind of medical care. Apparently, you have to be, killed by a cop to get a toxicologist to examine the contents of your stomach upon death. You have to be killed by a cop to have, a surgeon examine you, to have it's just like amazing. But there's not a nook or cranny that is part of George Floyd's body that hasn't been examined and tested and looked at and dissected and weighed and judged, and unbelievable amounts of medical examination. And yet every single one of these medical specialties, from toxicology to pulmonary experts, we now know that Dr. Martin Tobin, the Irishman, I apologize to Irishmen, I associated him with Scotland for a brief moment, that he really wrote the book on mechanical resuscitation. He literally wrote that textbook. He is an expert in pulmonary resuscitation. He is an expert in lung issues. He's an expert pulmonologist. And, he testified the same way that the toxicologist testified, that Sergeant Steiger testified, that Dr. Smock, the surgeon, and the ER doctor testified, the same way that the doctor this morning, the forensic pathologist, Dr. Lindsay Thomas, testified this morning.
You reviewed the toxicology.
Yes. Oh, yes.
How would you characterize the amount of meth in Mr. Floyd's system?
Well, it was there. It's not particularly high. Certainly in deaths that I have attributed to methamphetamine, it's been much higher. But it's not like there's any safe level of methamphetamine, but This was a very low level.
So was the methamphetamine significant in your assessment of the cause of death?
No.
Okay, it wasn't meth. Okay. And it wasn't fentanyl. And everybody agrees it wasn't meth, and everybody agrees it wasn't fentanyl. Everybody agrees, okay? By the way, we just got testimony from the medical examiner, who looks like Glenn, my friend Glenn, that there were no pills in his stomach. Now, poor Eric Nelson, the Chauvin's attorney, literally is going to stand there. I've already heard him insinuate this. There's no evidence at all about that would support this, but he has asked questions about this to various witnesses, not whether or not they saw any evidence of this, but what it would do if this happened. And by this, I mean shoved drugs up his bum. Truly, poor Eric has asked these witnesses what would happen if you took drugs and you shoved it up your bum. Like the absorption rate, would it be faster if you shoved it up your bum than if you ingested it by your mouth? Okay, really, this is all he's left with. Because remember, this part of the testimony, this part of the presentation by the prosecution, is about causation. This is the portion of the trial that matters the most. Especially to poor Eric, because poor Eric was saying to the jury at the beginning that George Floyd OD'd. Okay, this was his conclusion, and he was going to show this to the jury, and that anything but Chauvin caused George Floyd's death. Well, he's failing miserably at this endeavor, and it's all he has. It's truly all he has. So it's not going well, because every single expert in toxicology, in pulmonary issues, in cardio, in a surgeon, and a couple of ER docs, a medical, they have all testified that this death that you are seeing on video over and over and over again is called, the cause of death would be called positional asphyxia, meaning he suffocated under Chauvin's knee. Under Chauvin's knee. So, all right, let's, they're back. Here's poor Eric. He's going to do his best to try and say George died of something other than Eric Chauvin's knee.
You understand, Dr. Baker, that you've testified in many cases in Hennepin County before?
Yes, I have.
Dakota, Scott County as well?
Not nearly as much, but yes.
And you understand that as a part of the process of exchanging information, the defense receives copies of everything, your reports, meeting notes, prior statements you've given, things of that nature.
Yes.
Right? Okay. And have you had opportunities to review all of that information prior to your testimony today?
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
Okay. And ultimately what you testified is in a death investigation, it's much more than just simply an autopsy, agreed?
Correct.
And in fact, if you pull your file, it usually ends up being a few inches thick, right?
We're actually paperless at the medical examiner's office, but if you printed it out, I guess
poor
it would be a few
Eric.
inches thick.
Yeah. Well, that's what I did, and that's what it is. I guess I got to get with the times. But ultimately, that file contains your autopsy report, correct?
Correct.
Death certificate, the paperwork that you fill out for the state of Minnesota?
Yes. We don't actually get a copy of the death certificate from the state, but everything we put on the death certificate is in our file.
Right. And then you also keep track of conversations that you have with people, right?
Generally, yes. That's usually more my investigators who are talking to family, treating physicians, hospital records departments and stuff.
So you keep sort of a log, so to speak, of today investigator so-and-so spoke with X, right?
Again, I don't personally...
Okay, this seems to be a complete waste of time, but remember, Eric gets paid hourly. And whether he wins or loses, poor Eric is going to get paid. Yeah, he is. He's going to get paid. And you might be asking at this point, who the hell picked him? Nobody picked him. There's a rotation of attorneys. Yeah, a rotation of attorneys that are just rotated through a system, and it's luck of the draw, like who got the case, and that's how we got poor Eric.
This is the Randi Rhodes Show. To speak with Randi, dial 561-270-3844. That's 561-270-3844.
Our Dr. Andrew was a contrarian. He's the Rand Paul of the medical experts. Yes, he actually is testifying that he thinks, because, poor Eric is desperate to get him to say this, he thinks that heart disease and drugs played some role in George Floyd's death. And that's why he says he put it on the death certificate, okay? He is a contrarian. He's the only man, because you have to remember yesterday, Dr. Tobin, our fabulous pulmonary guy, he testified that a healthy person who was subjected to what George Floyd was subjected to would have died. So here is, Andy over here. He's the odd man out.
Took special, because you had learned that there was potential pressure to the neck, you took special steps to look at the neck area, shoulders, etc., right?
Yes.
And because of that, you did this unique incision, or this specific incision, to lift the skin off to look under the surface, so to speak.
That's correct.
All right, and we'll come back to that in a second.
This is the part where there's no bruises.
I want to focus on the heart for a little bit. You noted that the heart was dilated.
Yes.
What causes that?
So dilated is just fancy medical lingo for has gotten a little bit bigger than it used to be. Like when you blow up a balloon, it dilates, for lack of a better lay description. Mr. Floyd's heart was, if I can refer to my report, counselor.
Refresh your recollection?
It would.
580 grams. Mm-hmm.
So I described the ventricles, which are the two main pumping chambers of the heart, the right and left, as mildly dilated in Mr. Floyd's case. I would interpret that as being part and parcel of his high blood pressure. That's a manifestation of the heart getting bigger and heavier as it works against that continued high blood pressure over a period of time.
You also took note of the size of Mr. Floyd's heart, right?
It's actually the weight, counselor, but yes,
weight.
Absolutely did take note of the weight, yes.
All right, and that was 540 grams?
That is correct.
And you're familiar with the papers of DeMaio and Molina on the normal heart size?
I am familiar with DeMaio and Molina paper, although the one that I usually use is the Kitzman paper from the Mayo Clinic.
Of course, the Kitzman.
And what's the maximum size of a heart under that standard?
So the Kitzman paper normalizes heart weights as a function of your body length and your body weight. Because if you think about it, a very large person is going to have a larger heart than a very small person. So you don't want to penalize people for being too big or too small. That's why you normalize their heart weight. So in Mr. Floyd's case, the upper limit of normal for his body length, according to the reference that I use, is 510 grams. The upper limit of normal for his body weight would be 521 grams. Again, he was 540 grams, and so he is outside the upper limit of normal. That means on the bell-shaped distribution of heart weights for a man his size, he's way out on one of the tail ends, the heavy end.
Okay. And all of these various standards in terms of the weight of a heart, they're peer-reviewed?
As far as I know, yes. The reference I use is from the Mayo Clinic proceedings, which I'm
the
going to assume
Kitzman.
is
He said the Kitzman.
And as would be, say, DeMaio and Molina's or the Northwestern studies or any of these other studies?
I'm not familiar with the other studies you're referencing, Counselor. The DeMaio and Molina paper, I believe, was published in the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology, which I know to be peer-reviewed.
Okay. And you would agree that the larger the heart is, the more blood it needs to provide adequate oxygenation. Agreed?
As a general rule, I would say that is true, yes.
What types of things cause a person's heart to be bigger than normal?
The most common cause by far in adults in the developed world would be high blood pressure. There are a number of far less common causes. Aortic valve disease could do it if the heart's pumping against a defective valve. There are genetic causes of an enlarged heart. Typically, we can tell those by looking at the heart grossly and microscopically. Those are much farther down the list than high blood pressure, which again is the number one by a long shot.
And based on your review of Mr. Floyd's medical records, you determined that he has a history of high blood pressure, correct?
Yes, it was very helpful to learn that from his medical records. He was known to be hypertensive.
Can you describe the narrowing or the stenosis of the coronary arteries a little bit more detail?
I can, Counselor, if I may refer to my report again. So as I mentioned when I was describing the photographs earlier, he had 75% proximal and 75% mid narrowing of his left anterior descending coronary artery. Again, in most people, that would be the largest of the three coronary arteries. He had 75% narrowing of the first diagonal branch of his left anterior descending coronary artery. And then in his right coronary artery, which in most people is the second largest of the three, he had 90% proximal narrowing.
All right. And what do forensic pathologists generally consider to be enough narrowing of the arteries to cause a sudden death?
We usually look to 75% greater as capable of causing sudden death.
And are you familiar with myocyte necrosis?
Yes.
And do you have to have myocyte necrosis to cause a sudden death?
No, you do not.
In an arrhythmia, there would be no necrosis, correct?
So an arrhythmia is an electrical phenomenon, not an anatomic one, and so I really can never diagnose an arrhythmia post-mortem. We just have to infer that from the circumstances and from the condition of the coronaries.
And when we describe hypoxia of the heart, that's the reduction of oxygen to the heart, correct?
Correct.
And can you can hypoxia to the heart cause sudden death by other means? Or would it just be the arrhythmia?
Well, there's many ways that a lack of oxygen to the heart could cause death. One could be a sudden dysrhythmia, where the person's heart goes from a normal beat to a non-perfusing beat, and the person would literally just collapse right in front of you. depending on the nature of the coronary artery disease, a person could have a thrombus. They could present to the emergency room with crushing chest pain and sweating and difficulty breathing. That would be a different mechanism of death. So there's different ways the heart manifests that is not getting enough oxygen, but one of them is sudden collapse and death.
And sometimes people can survive that for a longer period of time.
Survive.
The thrombus you just described? I mean,
Correct. I mean, I don't know the numbers, but obviously people can and do survive thrombi in their coronary arteries. That's why we have clot-busting drugs and cardiologists on call for emergency rooms for urgent catheterizations and stuff like that.
Gotcha. Now, can you generally describe the conduction system of the heart?
Only in the broadest terms, because I'm not an expert in the conduction system of the heart. I have other people I rely on for that, but it's basically the electrical system of the heart.
And does
there's a part of your heart
inspections of
called
your
the
stomach's
sinoatrial node,
contents.
and that's like the little watch in your heart that starts.
So he's definitely a contrarian. Oh yeah, Andy, always the cute one, you know. It's always the cute one. It's not the one that looks like Wilford Brimley. No, that's not who you got to worry about. You got to worry about Dudley Do right here, the Canadian Mountie. Yeah, he uses the Kitzner. You know, not the DeMaio Molina. No. But anyway, he did write on the manner of death portion of the death certificate, homicide. He did. He's just being mined, if you will, by poor Eric for any tangential relationship of an enlarged heart, or which is a result of high blood pressure, or a sudden heart attack of some sort, as being the cause of death, so that Eric can get into at least one juror's mind reasonable doubt. That's what he's doing here. He's mining the jury for one juror who could say, he could have just had sudden thrombosis. He could have just had a sudden heart. It could have just, his heart could have been the 5-hand palm plant. It could have been, that where you take 5 steps and you just die. It could have been that. They did talk about jujitsu a lot. They did. It could be a Kill Bill situation.
Pieway wouldn't teach him that.
He does teach it, but only to, the bride. He only taught it to the bride. I don't think Bill knew it, because Bill knew that he had it applied to him, and that he had 5 steps to take before he passed out and died. Right? So this is what he's doing. So, he's talking a lot of, vasoconstrictor and methamphetamine. Is it a vasoconstrictor? And again, remember, there's been testimony from a pulmonologist, there's been testimony from a police surgeon, there's been testimony from a toxicologist, there's been testimony from a forensic pathologist, there's been testimony from Sergeant Steiger and all kinds of homicide detectives. None of them agree with Andy here. None of them.
Mary had a little man. The fault. We believe that all men are created equal.
To the magnificent mosaic that is America.
From radio beacon to radio beacon. I have a dream today. Change has come to America.
Believe me.
Help is on the way.
Knock, knock. Who's there?
It's a figment of your imagination.
Randi Rhodes Show.
Turn up your mind.
All right, remember, poor Eric is looking for any little tiny bit of information that he can give to a jury that would suggest that George Floyd died of natural causes. But remember, even this medical examiner who did George Floyd's autopsy concluded that the manner in which George Floyd died was homicide. Now, did he believe that there was a contribution made because George Floyd had a hypertension, high blood pressure, and because he had clogged arteries? He, in his best opinion, in his best, view of the entire situation, believes that the hypertension, the high blood pressure, and the poor condition of George Floyd's arteries contributed to his death. Now, he is an outlier. He's the only medical expert who testified this way. although his ultimate conclusion of the manner of death is homicide. So in the end, he may think that George Floyd's physical condition played a role in George Floyd's own death. He did not think that that was the manner in which George Floyd died. He didn't think natural causes. And that's why it was important that we went over the 5 manners of death that are available to put on a death certificate. And we went over them, right? There's undetermined, meaning we just don't know. There's suicide, meaning you intended to hurt yourself. There's homicide, meaning you died at the hands of another. There's accidental, which would mean a drug overdose, and a number of other things, like you tripped on a lawn chair and you banged your head on the side of the pool, and you died. You died, right? And then there's natural. And this doctor did not believe that the manner was natural. He believed the manner was a homicide. So, listen, Eric is earning his, $2,000-$3,000 an hour right now. Oh, don't laugh. That's what you get at trial. That's what you get at trial. It's like amazing because you don't just show up there. You know what I mean? It's like hours and hours. Although you bill for those too. The whole thing is billable. But anyway, he's mining for any little thing he can repeat in closing arguments to this jury to pick off at least one for reasonable doubt about the manner of death and why George Floyd is not with us anymore.
Bruises. You did say consistent with the size of your fingers. That might be true on television shows, but in the real world, there's not a lot of correlation between the size of bruises we see and the size of assailants' hands. But we are looking for those telltale bruises.
All right. And in terms of, in this particular case, the knee, the placement of the knee being a pretty bony, hard, round object, right?
The knee is flat.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty concentrated right under the kneecap at the force.
Right. And of course, the shin bone is just below the skin, right?
Yes.
And it's sort of triangular in its nature, right?
On cross-section, yes.
And so if a substantial amount of force was being used by the knee or the shin bone on the neck or back area in your line of work, and if that force was sufficient to asphyxiate him, would you expect to see bruising?
No.
I would expect to see bruising, but I don't know that the lack of bruising excludes that. You and I kind of just pivoted from strangulation, which is really pressure to the front of the neck, to the pressure of the back of the neck. And that's just not something that I think we see as medical examiners, pressure to the back of the neck explaining a strangulation.
Or an asphyxiation.
Correct.
No.
So is there any objective medical finding in your autopsy that shows a sufficient or significant amount of pressure to the back?
Again, I think we've covered this. I did not find any injuries to Mr. Floyd's back, not on the outside of his body, not looking at the soft tissue under his skin
so
to make
listen,
sure I didn't miss any
I'm going to mute this for a brief moment. We can go back to Dr. Andrew here, but I need to show you something, okay? Here is what you see in the video, okay? This is what you see in the video.
What you're seeing is the orientation of Officer Chauvin. His body build is quite erect here, but in particular what you're seeing is that the toe of his boot is no longer touching the ground. This means that all of his body weight is being directed down at Mr. Floyd's neck.
So are we supposed to forget that we saw that? I can't forget that I saw that.
With hypoxia. Would a person exhibit certain symptoms?
So symptoms is a little outside my bailiwick because we're talking about living people, and I don't treat living people who are suffering from hypoxia of any cause.
So, I mean, Dr. Thomas, who just testified, would testify that you may see confusion when someone is going into a hypoxic state.
Objection, Your Honor, to the characterization of Dr. Thomas's testimony.
Rephrases.
Certainly.
What he agrees to.
So, your role as a medical examiner, right? You take into consideration information from lots of different sources. Okay?
That is true.
And there may be cases where you just don't know what's going on, right?
Oh,
you can't
Eric.
figure something out.
Could you be more specific?
Really? What is this
You
question?
have a decedent in your
On your table? Yeah,
medical
go ahead.
examining table, and there appears to be some sort of tropical disease, right? I'm assuming you're not a tropical disease
This
or
man
an infectious
loves
disease expert.
hypotheticals. Okay, no one died of a tropical
Certainly
disease
not an
here.
expert in tropical diseases.
What
We
are you
do
doing?
diagnose a lot of infectious diseases at the MD office.
But if there's some sort of infectious or tropical disease, you may go to another person and ask that person, hey, are you familiar with this?
I object to the question
Relevance.
in terms of relevance and beyond the scope.
Beyond the scope,
Beyond the
that's
scope
true
is
too.
overruled. Relevance at this point is sustained.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you rely on the expertise of other physicians when you conduct an autopsy?
Not always, but I am never above reaching out to clinical colleagues or
But
other
basically,
pathologists if they have
I'm
an
a
area of expertise that
loner.
can help me.
And part of your job as a pathologist is to attempt to determine whether there is asphyxia in a particular case, right?
Again, it completely depends on the nature of the case, counselor, but if it appears to be an asphyxial death, we're always trying to get at the root of how did this occur? Why did this person asphyxiate?
And as a physician, you're physician and a forensic pathologist, you're familiar with what happens to the human body when someone asphyxiates, right?
In general, yes. Again, I don't
I don't
actually
treat
see
living
living people
people.
asphyxiate. I don't treat living victims of different types of asphyxia in a clinical setting.
But in the context of your research or education, you may go to a conference and they're saying, here's
You're
an
hurting at a
asphyxia
conference.
death. Let's
Okay.
talk about it, right? Here's a picture of someone hanging from all the way fully suspended versus someone who is on their knees and suspended forward with a belt or something.
Object to the question is vague and relevant.
Seriously, what is the relevance to this
Sustained
case?
is
A
relevant.
belt around your neck. What do you listen to? In excess? And
Are you familiar
what
with
is
the
that?
symptoms of hypoxia?
Again, they would be very general symptoms, and I don't know what the differential diagnosis for those
I
symptoms
mean, is
would be.
poor
What would the
Eric like
general
this
symptoms
close
be?
to saying
Of
that it was
hypoxia?
auto asphyxiation,
Probably some
hanging
form
from
of
a door,
mental
getting him?
status change
I mean,
in
really,
the
where are we?
form of confusion or disorientation.
Incoherent speech?
Again, the differential
don't
diagnosis
treat
for
living
something like
people.
that is so long.
Oh God. Okay, it is a weird career choice Dr. Andrew Baker made. He's a very cute man, went all the way through med school, was a resident, was an intern, did the whole thing, didn't sleep for like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. And then decided, I'm a loner. I want to work on dead people, is what I want to do. I don't want to be responsible for anybody's life. I don't want to be responsible for knowing too much about their lungs or their cardio or their belly or their brain. I just want to weigh things and dissect them and take photographs of organs.
All things Randy at RandyRhodes.com.
Go for launch.
Speaking truth to power, the Randi Rhodes Show.
Okay, I had to laugh. You know, have you noticed our new promos if you're watching us, on the YouTubes and stuff like that? I mean, if you're watching on Free Speech, you don't see them. But everybody that's watching on Periscope or any of the non-free speech TV, you are seeing those promos, okay? And they're great. They're unbelievably great. It rivals, the Lincoln Project. It's just as good as the recap. I mean, it's real top-notch stuff. So who did that? Who's making those? Who's doing this? Who's, on my team now? So that would be, Jimmy. That would be my ex-husband, Jimmy, who makes those things. We used to work together, at WIOD all those years ago. Anyway, Jimmy's brilliant. I mean, his work is like freaking awesome. It's really evolved since Randi Rhodes, Goddess of the Nighttime, Volume 1. Yes, it's evolved. So is my hairstyle, gotta say, and so is Jimmy. But, we didn't have a budget. Jimmy's doing this because he loves me. Love does not turn to hate, everybody. I just want you to know that. It just doesn't. Love is always love. And at least in our family it is. My family it is. So Jimmy and I are working together again, right? But we don't have a budget for to pay a voiceover dude. So at the end of that promo, that's Jimmy from New Jersey over there. And he put heavy reverb on his own damn self to do the voice. So I asked Brett, would he please just do the...
First of all, I've learned a ton since Jimmy has come on. I can't tell you how amazing that dude is.
Yeah.
And second, thanks for the pressure. Appreciate that.
So I asked Brett, could you please just do the voiceover part? Because, the Bias Stinker podcast thing, I could handle that. I could say that, I could do that. And he can, he can edit that part in, right? He could do that. But on this one, there's like a little bit of a script. I can't even say it on Free Speech TV because I'm not allowed to pitch anything of my own. It's a deal we have, and I agree to it. And so it's not nefarious or ugly or anything. It's fine. It's good. It's all good. But when we're not on their air, yes, I have to do stuff, to get the money flowing, to get some obscene amounts of profit going my way. Yeah, right. That's why I wear the same shirts every week, because I'm so rich. But no, and so Jimmy's doing all this on no budget, and it's pretty awesome, except for the voiceover. The voiceover is killing me. It's killing me. And I can't even play it for you on Free Speech TV because it would be him saying that you should do something that I'm not allowed to tell you to do. Okay? So, you know what? You're just going to have to switch over to our YouTube channel and see what I'm talking about, because you can see what I'm talking about there. Or, it's Friday. We give the whole show away for free on Friday. So just, scroll on through and you'll see what I'm talking about. But his work is insanely good. And then that voiceover just screws. You know what? It's like the prosecution's case here in the Chauvin trial. Their case has been flawless. It's been awesome. It's been insanely good. It's been consistent. It's been, hey, listen, the man did not, And now they're talking to a guy who freely admits, I have never examined a live patient in my entire life. Don't ask me about asphyxia. I have no earthly idea. I do not treat live patients. I made a very weird choice with my life as a young medical guy that I just didn't want the pressure of having to save a life ever. So I only weigh dead people's organs is what I do. Well, hats off to you, Andrew. Some people like working alone. I get it. Your choice. Free country and all that. But, this poor Eric dude, this lawyer, is just groping around trying to find any testimony that he could regurgitate at closing. That's what this is all for, at closing argument, to put a reasonable doubt in one juror's mind. And that's all he needs. That's all poor Eric needs, is one juror to not believe that the prosecution proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And if poor Eric can get that, what poor Eric will end up with is a hung jury, and that would be victory for him. There's no way anybody's going to acquit Derek Chauvin. No, there's no way. That does not happen here. So anybody who's watching this trial thinking that, at the end the jury could just, acquit him, and or the jury could just say not guilty. No, that's not going to happen. There are too many videos from too many angles and too much testimony from too many experts, from too many police officers. The apparently the police code that you don't testify against your own. Either it doesn't exist and they've been telling us a fib all these years, or this case was so heinous that the Hennepin County Police Department, the Minneapolis Police Department, just felt like they could not stand by this dude and they were going to just testify their brains out about, his brutality. I don't know. But there's just too much for a not guilty verdict. So the best thing that poor Eric, can hope for is that one juror says that the prosecution did not prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And what does that really mean? It means that they think that Andrew, who likes to, dissect things, that Andrew's conclusion that it was a homicide still gives them a little bit of wiggle room, in that if George Floyd didn't have heart disease, and if George Floyd didn't take a small amount of methamphetamine, and while I agree that there is no safe amount of methamphetamine that you could possibly take, and if George Floyd, didn't have these two things going on, he would, but for those two things, he would not be dead. Well, that is not the conclusion of Andrew. Andy is not going there. Andy put on the medical thing, he put homicide as the manner of death. And we know there's only 5 things you could put. There's only 5 things you could put. You could say you couldn't figure it out. You could say it was suicide. You could say it was accidental, which would be a drug thing. You could say it was natural, which would be a heart thing, which would be a hypertension thing, it would be a pulmonary embolism or a brain fart or whatever, and it was fatal, right? He didn't put that. He put homicide. He put homicide. Eric wants to approach the witness. Why does he want to approach the witness?
In this proceeding, did you testify about, do you recall testifying about how the coronary arteries work relevant to
He's really trying.
providing the heart with blood?
I'm almost certain that I would have. I can't imagine that I didn't, but I don't recall how extensively that took place without looking at the transcript again.
Would looking at the transcript refresh your recollection about your testimony?
Oh, this is why he wants to approach the witness.
connection. May I approach?
No, don't come near me. Do not come near me. Ay. He's literally going to give him the transcript of what he said to the department after the autopsy that he performed on the 26th of May, a day after George Floyd died. That's what's going on here. Anyway, the reason for all of this, strenuous effort is to get one jury member to say, well, maybe if he did. But remember, every other medical person who does treat live patients, right, and a toxicologist and all that, said Chauvin's left knee on George Floyd's neck in a prone position and his right knee on Floyd's back, arm, and side, combined with him being flat on the ground, suffocated him.
Call in, connect. To speak to Randy, call 561-270-3844. 561-270-3844.
All right, poor Eric just gave up. He just gave up and sat down. So now we have the lead prosecutor, Jerry Blackwell, trying to clean this mess up.
Those other contributing conditions are not conditions that you consider direct causes. Is that true?
Yes.
They are not direct causes of Mr. Floyd's death. That's true. They're contributing causes.
Thank you.
And in terms of manner of death, you found then, and do you stand by today, that the manner of death for Mr. Floyd was, as you would call it, homicide?
Yes, I would still classify it as a homicide today.
Thank you, Dr. Baker.
Nothing further. Yay. Good for you, Jerry Blackwell. In two questions, he cleared all that up and took all that effort from poor Eric away. Because in the end, Dr. Andy over there, while he likes to weigh hearts and grams and look at, subcutaneous tissue for bruising and, he concluded that George Floyd is dead because of a homicide. He concluded that George Floyd did not die of a heart attack, did not die of a drug overdose, did not die from any of those other contributing factors. He died because Derek Chauvin put his freaking knee on George Floyd's back and narrowed his hypopharynx, the part of the throat where air passes through, and killed him, suffocated him, asphyxiated him, and that is why George Floyd is dead. Okay, so I believe they're done for the day. Yes. Okay, there the camera just went up to the Great Seal of Minnesota, so we're done. That is the conclusion of the second week of testimony in the murder trial of Derek Chauvin in the murder of George Floyd. And right now, I believe that justice is possible. I do. I really do. I think that, I'm pretty sure that Derek Chauvin is going to go to jail. I'm not, I know Brett's looking at me, he's like, well, Randy, there just takes one juror, just takes one. I'm pretty sure Derek Chauvin is going to jail. I just don't know for how long. And I just don't know which jail. Is he going to go to state prison? Is he going to go to federal prison? This is what Derek Chauvin wanted. Derek Chauvin wanted to go to federal prison. He didn't want to go to state, prison. He wanted to make a deal with the feds. And he wanted to plead to third degree. murder and do 10 years. And why did he want that? He wanted that because he understands if he goes to state prison, he's pretty much going to have to be in solitary confinement for his own safety. That's number one. Number two, he wanted to go to the feds because Club Fed is better, and also because he could plead to third degree, and he could only he would do 10 years is what he would be willing to do. Now, I don't know if you remember this or not. Bill Barr actually said, maybe I will, do a federal deal with him. Maybe I will. And then he realized, oh, the whole world was watching. Oh, crap. Yeah, 50 million people have seen the murder of George Floyd on videotape. 50 million people. Worldwide, that tape has been seen. It's a disgusting example of American exceptionalism, is what it is. But the whole world has seen it. And so Bill Barr realized, I just can't. And also, Derek Chauvin wanted an agreement that the feds would never prosecute a civil rights claim against Derek Chauvin, because if they did, then it could turn into a hate crime and he could go to jail for the rest of his life. Now, Barr almost did some sort of a deal with him, but didn't. He just didn't do it because he realized the whole world was watching this. Third degree was not going to cut it. And if he signed on to the federal government never pursuing a civil rights violation against Derek Chauvin, no, it wouldn't serve any purpose other than inflaming people. So that's why he's he's not on trial. Well, he is on trial in the state. He is on trial in the state, not feds. It's not a federal trial. This is the state of Minneapolis. And I was only reminded of that when the camera goes up to the Great Seal. See, if you show my computer right now, you'll see what I'm talking. So the camera, when it goes down for the day, right, it actually goes up. Okay, when it goes down for the day, it goes up, and you see the seal of the state of Minnesota, right? That's because this is a state court. This is not federal court. This is not the Department of Justice. This is a state. You can take it down now. I think people get what I mean. All right, Rhonda in Pennsylvania.
Randi Rhodes, how are you?
Oh, Rhonda in Erie. Oh.
Yes.
Hey.
It's me. I haven't called you in a long time.
I think about you so much.
I've been trying to preserve my mental health through all of this. I watch.
I was just I'm gonna let you talk, but I just was wondering if it was too much, too painful, too horrible for you. I was.
Yes. And it has been for quite some time now, but I did want to tell you, I still, even with that, I tell you what I do. I turn you on every day because I want to make sure that you get the views. So I turn it on every day and I just mute it because it's just hard to deal with. But I want to tell you that I'm glad you're doing it, Randi, because this work is so important. And Black folks and, other minoritized people have been dealing with this stuff, for centuries. And this is now finally people who've never had to deal with this are seeing it, and it's important for other people to see it because we can't make change otherwise. People have to know the truth, and you're doing that. And I know it's hard for you too, so I really appreciate you doing it.
Well, I mean, I've cried on the air. Look, I'm about to cry now. So many times already. Looking at it over and over. It's traumatizing. It is.
Yeah.
But the word that I was just writing down as you were speaking, sometimes I make little notes so that I can circle back. Was change, right? That the reason why we're doing it is because to make change, people have to know what needs to change. They need to see it. So yeah, it's really hard. It's hard. It's hard.
They do. I don't know any other way to do this.
I don't either.
Right? You can't tell people about it because we've been telling people about it, literally for centuries. And the thing that this trial has been doing, I think, is just making people, aware of just
the brutality of it.
The brutality, that's the word.
Yes.
And because, you can't imagine a person actually being this brutal. You can't.
No, because, and I've said this a million times, Rhonda, and I know you've been with me a really long time. We've been through a lot together, you and me, and we don't know, but honestly, people don't know people who are this cruel. And okay, and that's why it's so hard for people to accept that this really happens, because we don't pal around or hang around or even know anybody this cruel. But
you're absolutely right.
But these are the people that walk amongst us. These are the people that we have to cope and deal with in our society, and we have to develop a society that doesn't let them go unnoticed and lets them be tolerated for an instant. Period.
This is the Randi Rhodes Show. To speak with Randi, dial 561-270-3844. That's 561-270-3844.
To cause, all right, to cause something in Minnesota law means that what you did was a substantial causal factor in Floyd's death. What does that mean? It means you are responsible for all consequences that reasonably occur from what you did. The fact that other causes contribute to a death does not necessarily relieve the defendant of criminal liability.
Right.
That will be the operative concept that decides this trial with the jurors.
Exactamente. Exactamente. No, seriously, exactly. The pre-existing conditions, whether or not, I mean, look, his stomach had no pills in it, so that whole drug thing is like out the window. So, of course, poor Eric's going to try and shove it up his bum, as I told you. I don't know. But because you stood on this man not only for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, but almost 4 of those minutes, that man was dead. And you caused his death, no matter what else was in play. You are responsible for him being dead. Especially when you consider that Chauvin is a police officer and took him, George Floyd, into custody. Took him into custody, put handcuffs on him. And at that moment, he became responsible for George Floyd's health and well-being. And George Floyd was subdued. George Floyd was in handcuffs when he sat on the sidewalk. You got to remember that the whole time that Derek Chauvin was in George Floyd's life, for that whole time. I mean, when Chauvin first, I don't know if you remember this or not, but when Chauvin first walked up to the SUV, to George Floyd's SUV, he put a gun in his face. He put a freaking gun in his face. Like from the beginning. Something was really up with Chauvin. Something was really off. Now, we've only made our way through a couple of portions of the trial, okay? We made our way through the terrible, boisterous crowd that was comprised of a 9-year-old girl, was comprised of a girl who was 17. She's the one who took the video. An off-duty firefighter, an elderly man. I won't call him elderly. He was a man in his 60s, Mr. McMillan, who, likes to walk around his neighborhood and was very familiar with everything that goes on in his neighborhood. He even recognized Derek Chauvin. He didn't know him, but he recognized him as a beat cop from this area, So these were the crazy, obstinate, people that made Chauvin's job impossible to do. Yeah, that failed. So the only other thing that poor Eric has is causation. And in Minnesota law, and as in most murder charges, especially if you're a police officer and a person is in your custody, which Floyd was for a really long time, because from the moment he took him out of the car, he put handcuffs on him. He had a gun in his face, turned him around, put handcuffs on him, and sat him down on the sidewalk. Remember that? Remember that? Before he actually tried to put him into his cruiser, which caused George Floyd to get agitated because he said, "I have claustrophobia, please let me sit in the front seat." But when he first was put in handcuffs, there was no resistance at all. He put the handcuffs on George Floyd. George Floyd allowed that to happen. George Floyd was walked out of his vehicle across the street and sat on the ground in handcuffs. So the crowd did not make anything difficult or impossible. And like I said, if you can't perform your job in front of people, don't be me. Don't be a talk show host. Don't be a podcaster. Don't be a stripper. And don't be a police officer. Kenyatta in L.A.
Hello, Randy. I enjoy your show. I want to tell you that there's a pattern here, and I'm a contributing columnist for Black Agenda Report, and I recently, after the Breonna Taylor murder, wrote a piece called "Once Dead, Thrice Killed." And what happens in these cases, and we see it over and over and over again, first, the life of the oxygen supply and the cessation of the heartbeat of that black person takes place. Then secondarily, their character is assassinated. And then thirdly, these officers are constantly acquitted. They get away with this stuff, and that is to demoralize a whole race of people. We saw it with Sandra Bland. She was apparently smoking marijuana. Trayvon Martin apparently had, even though that wasn't a police officer involved death, he apparently had weed in his book bag. How many suburban white boys at 17 have weed in their book bags?
Oh, please, everybody in this audience has weed in their book bag, except for me. Right, and I'm not, and I get yelled at for saying that I don't. So yeah, go ahead.
You know, Latasha Harlan's death. She was a 15-year-old black child killed by a Korean store owner, and people think that the riots in '92. And I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I'm also a former police officer. But I wasn't one for very long. The whole craft is way too racist. Even the training is racist. Think about policing in this country. Even if the cars aren't black and white, people still refer to them as black and whites. And you probably know this, Randy, that police evolved in this country from slave patrols. The silhouette targets that you fire on with the range master are a black silhouette target on a white background. This stuff is inculcated, but there's something about this George Floyd case that is really conspicuous to me. As it's a 400-pound gorilla, or they say an 800-pound gorilla, but gorillas aren't 800 pounds, and that's this. Derek Chauvin, and you just talked about him walking up and pointing a gun in this man's face immediately. Derek Chauvin knew George Floyd.
Yeah.
They had previous contact, and why that has not come up in this trial is something very peculiar.
Well, no. See, that's where I was going, Kenyatta. Actually, the prosecution is very methodical, okay? The first portion of the trial was the bystanders, and it was an effort to show the jury what we're talking about. Look, here's what happened. Here are the people that they're going to blame that made it so impossible for, these four police officers on this one guy. These are the individuals that made it so impossible for them to do their job right? Because, you had a 9-year-old and a 17-year-old and an off-duty firefighter. Okay, and then the next portion of the trial was the medical testimony, the toxicology, the pulmonary guy, the medical.
Oh, he was
examiner.
Brilliant yesterday.
Yeah, he was. And so the idea that Chauvin knew George Floyd hasn't come up yet because they are not there yet. They're not there.
I see.
But I want you to remember this little detail because, the detail is this. There was a club. It was called Nuevo Rodeo, right? No, Nuevo Rodeo. I got to say it properly. And outside security was Chauvin. Inside bouncer was George Floyd. Outside security was Chauvin for 17 years. He worked outside that club. 17 years. Now, the owner who sold the club, she said she cannot say whether they knew each other. In all that time, she cannot say whether they knew each other. But we're going to find out because it's out there and it's got to be dealt with and it will be dealt with. And so when people,
Randy, you know what? That dog don't hunt, and you know it. And I'll say this and shut my mouth. It was the great philosopher Voltaire who said this. If I can convince you of absurdities, then I can get you to commit atrocities.
Yeah. But what does that have to do with whether or not we'll hear testimony about whether they knew each other?
Well, when I'm talking about the absurdities, I'm talking about this constant mantra that to devalue the lives of these people that have been murdered by the police consistently over and over again.
It's endless. This is an endless parade of black bodies that have had the most amount of violence inflicted on them with absolute impunity. That is why it's so it's so now, necessary to look, we had Rodney King on videotape. I remember working, back in 92. I didn't do politics, then I did flat out entertainment, locally in Miami. But there were people calling up saying Rodney King deserved it. He was drunk driving, and there's no such thing as a right. I mean, but now, right, and it's going on now to the point where people are starting to realize. Oh, Emmett Till was just the first person I ever heard about that was killed for whistling at a white woman. He was just the first little boy. Okay, now I see Trayvon, and now I see Breonna Taylor, and now I see, right? And I should have said something in 92. I should have been on the right side of history back then. Maybe we could have saved all these lives, but no. And the reason is simple, and Rhonda and I discussed it before you called. Most decent Americans don't know anybody this brutal, but they're there, and you know it, and I know it, and we're now seeing them on videotape. They're men, they're women, they're Karens, and they're Kevins. And some of them have badges. In fact, a whole lot of them do. Have a great weekend, everybody.